All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we are diving deep into something that's been in the news a lot lately, and that is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Things are, things are getting pretty intense, as we all know. It's March 2025. That means it's been 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and, we've seen a lot of support from the West, but the situation is just getting more complicated. We've got some big news to break down today, and it all comes from a recent CBS News article. The Trump administration has announced they're pausing billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a big deal for sure, not just some small thing. I mean, pausing aid at this point in the game, it's a huge move that could have big consequences for Ukraine and, well, really the whole world.
Right. I was pretty shocked when I first read that. So the article says that President Trump, he's trying to frame this pause as a way to push for peace. He wants to make sure Ukraine is really serious about finding a peaceful resolution. But I have to say, something feels off about this whole thing. The article also mentions this pretty tense meeting that happened in the Oval Office. Trump and VP J.D. Vance, they basically publicly criticized Zelenskyy, said he wasn't grateful enough, even accused him of disrespect.
Yeah, and that public criticism, that's a big clue here. It makes you think this isn't really about peace, it's about power. Trump's using this aid pause as a way to force Zelenskyy into a peace deal, but a peace deal that works for Trump. The question is, what does that peace deal look like? What kind of concessions is he going to demand from Ukraine?
Yeah, that's the big mystery, and it's obviously causing a lot of worry in Ukraine. The article quotes Mikhailo Podolyak, who's a top advisor to Zelenskyy, and he basically says, look, Ukraine is going to keep fighting no matter what, but losing U.S. support is going to hurt a lot. There's this one quote from him that really got to me. He asks, would the U.S. really be okay just standing by while Russia keeps attacking?
I think that quote says it all. It really shows how tense things are between the U.S. and Ukraine right now. Ukraine is looking to us for help, for leadership, and then the Trump administration does this. It makes you wonder if the U.S. is really committed to defending democracy, not just in Ukraine, but, in the whole region.
It's got to be a huge blow to the Ukrainian people. I mean, they've been fighting so hard for their freedom. The CBS article, I'll give them credit, they really show the human side of the conflict. They interviewed some Ukrainian soldiers who were recovering from injuries. And one of them, Alexei, he's a grandfather in his 50s, and he's already been wounded once, but he wants to get back to the front lines as soon as he can. He said he's fighting for the sake of my granddaughter. You just feel how much that means to him.
Yeah, those personal stories, they remind us that this isn't just about politics and strategy. It's about people's lives, real people who are risking everything. And Alexei, he's the perfect example of how strong and resilient the Ukrainian people are. They're not giving up, even after all of this. But can they really do it alone? The article mentions that a Ukrainian official, they estimate they can only keep their military going for maybe 6 months without more aid from the U.S. And that's if everything goes perfectly, which.
6 months? That's not a lot of time,
Yeah.
especially considering what they're up against. And, Zelensky's been warning us about Putin's ambitions for years. He sees this whole thing as part of a bigger plan. Putin wants to bring back the Soviet Union, and he sees NATO and Europe as the enemy. So this isn't just about Ukraine surviving. This is about the future of Europe, maybe even the whole world.
You're right, the stakes are incredibly high. And it looks like to understand what's going to happen next, we need to look at Europe. They're carrying a lot of the weight already. Over half of the military aid that's going to Ukraine is coming from Europe. And now with the U.S. hitting pause on aid, it's a real test for them.
Yeah, all eyes are on Europe now, that's for sure. The CBS article says that European leaders are saying they'll step up, they'll give even more support, especially with Russia still using those drone attacks on cities like Sumy and Odessa. But can Europe really handle that? Can they step up like that in the long run? I don't know.
That is the question, isn't it? This whole situation is shaking things up, like changing the whole game board. If the U.S. is pulling back, Europe's got to step forward, maybe more than we've ever seen before. And that might mean more than just money. It might mean troops on the ground.
That's a big change, and it makes you think, can they even agree on that? All those different European countries, can they give Ukraine what they need to push back against Russia? And what about NATO, the whole alliance between the U.S. and Europe? What happens to that?
Oh, those are good points. We're going to dig into all of that. But first, I want to talk about what could actually happen if this aid pause goes on. There's this really sharp article from Foreign Affairs magazine by a guy who used to be a U.S. ambassador to NATO. And he thinks this pause, it could actually make Putin bolder, like he might get even more aggressive, not just in Ukraine, but maybe in other countries nearby too.
So this isn't just a Ukraine problem then. It could mess up the whole region.
That's exactly it. And there's more. This article, it talks about how this could hurt America's reputation in the world. Like, if we're seen as unreliable, not keeping our promises, that weakens our alliances and makes those authoritarian leaders all over the world, well, it makes them feel stronger. This is bigger than Ukraine, way bigger. Think about places like Taiwan. They're dealing with similar threats, powerful neighbors that want to take over. They're watching this all very closely. And what they see now, that could change how they decide to act.
That's pretty scary to think about. So what about Ukraine? Like directly, what happens to them?
Well, this Foreign Affairs article, it doesn't paint a pretty picture. They're saying that without help from the U.S., Ukraine might have to make a peace deal, but a bad one that gives Russia pretty much everything they want. And then we have to ask, does that mean Ukraine gets split up? Does Russia just take some of their land? It's a chilling thought, but we can't ignore it.
I can't even imagine what that would be like for the people living there in those parts of Ukraine.
It's their lives on the line, literally. They could be oppressed, forced out of their homes, even killed if Russia takes over. This isn't just about land, it's about people, families, their whole future.
A humanitarian crisis waiting to happen. Is there any good news at all? Any solutions people are talking about?
Well, this Foreign Affairs article does offer a sliver of hope, I guess you could say. The author, they think the U.S. could still change course, could get back on track and support Ukraine. But it's going to take a really clear plan, everyone working together.
So what would that look like? What needs to happen?
The big thing they say is for the U.S. to team up with their allies in Europe and really give Ukraine what they need, the money, the weapons, to stand up to Russia. And that's where this idea of strategic ambiguity comes in.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase, but honestly, I'm not sure what it means, especially here.
Good question, that's fair. It basically means, letting Putin know we're serious, we're ready to fight, but without actually saying we'll send in troops. So like maybe the U.S. sends more ships to the Black Sea or does more military exercises with NATO right next to Russia, that kind of thing.
So showing strength, showing we're ready, but not actually starting a war ourselves.
Exactly. And that would send a message to Putin, let him know that the West, we're united, we're going to protect what's ours, even if the U.S. isn't directly fighting. It's tricky, for sure, but it might be the best way to stop Russia from getting any bolder.
This Foreign Affairs article, they also talk about how important diplomacy is. They say military support is essential, but it has to go hand in hand with trying to find a peaceful solution. But how do you even talk to someone like Putin, He doesn't exactly have a good track record of being honest.
It's a valid concern, for sure. But the article, it makes the point that any diplomacy, any talks, they have to come with a strong message. The West needs to be clear, crystal clear, that if Russia does anything else aggressive, there will be consequences, serious ones. And that means being ready to hit them with even harder sanctions, give Ukraine even more weapons, and basically make NATO stronger in the region.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Right.
Military strength, talking it out, and standing with Ukraine, letting them decide their own future.
Exactly. But we can't forget, this isn't just the U.S. and Europe in this. To really understand what's happening, we need to see things from Russia's point of view.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what is Putin's deal? What's he after? Is it just about taking more land, or is there more to it?
Well, that's where our next source comes in. We've got this report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and they take a deep dive into what's happening inside Russia, like what's pushing them to do this in Ukraine. And it's pretty eye-opening.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of the big takeaways?
So they're saying that Putin's motivations, they're not so simple. It's not just about land or global power plays. It's like this mix of, old grudges, national pride, and trying to stay in power at home.
Old grudges. That's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, the report says Putin, he sees the Soviet Union falling apart as this big injustice, like a wound that never healed. He wants to make Russia powerful again like it used to be, and he thinks Ukraine should be part of Russia, always has been culturally and historically. To him, Ukraine shouldn't even be a separate country.
So it's about pride, about wanting to change history. But you also mentioned staying in power. How does this war help him do that?
That's a key piece of this. The CSIS report, it says Putin's using this war to, tighten his grip on power and shut down anyone who disagrees with him. The Kremlin's message is that this is a patriotic war, Russia against the West, and anyone who says different is a traitor.
So the war is actually helping him stay in control.
For now, it seems like it is. They say in the report that, at least at first, the war made a lot of Russians rally behind Putin. But in the long term, nobody knows.
Well, I mean, this war is costing Russia a ton, right? Soldiers dying, the economy getting hit by sanctions. At some point, That's got to hurt his popularity, don't you think?
You'd think so, right? The report says that, yeah, the money problems are getting worse and people might start turning against him. But we got to remember, Putin's been through tough times before. He's survived them all. He knows how to make people believe what he wants, how to stay in charge, even when things are bad.
So more questions than answers, huh?
Yeah.
What's going to happen with Putin? How long can he keep this war going? And what's the final price tag going to be for Russia, both inside the country and on the world stage?
Those are the million-dollar questions, the ones experts are going to be debating for years to come. But one thing's for sure, this isn't over, not by a long shot. And the stakes, they couldn't be higher. This is more than just a regional conflict. This could change the whole world order.
Wow, this is a lot to process, I got to admit. We've gone from the U.S. stopping their aid to what it means for the world, to what's going on inside Putin's head. It's complicated, and things are changing every day. I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed, to be honest.
Oh, I get it. It's a lot to take in. But even with all this big picture stuff, we can't forget about the people, the real people, whose lives are being turned upside down by this war.
You're right. Behind all the politics and the military stuff, there are real people going through this nightmare.
Exactly. And those stories, they matter just as much as the big picture analysis. We can't forget about the human cost of this war.
Well said. Before we get into those stories, though, I think we need a moment to just, let all of this sink in. We'll be right back with more from the deep dive. All right, so we're back, and I think it's time to talk about some of the human stories that are coming out of this conflict. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, the politics and the strategy, but for me, it's those personal stories that really show us what war is all about, the real cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Those personal stories are so important. They remind us that this isn't just some kind of game that's being played on a map. It's about real people, real families whose lives are being torn apart by this war.
The CBS News article has some really powerful interviews with Ukrainians who are living through this every single day. Like there's this one woman, she had to escape from Mariupol with her 2 kids, and she talks about how terrifying it was living under constant bombing. They spent weeks hiding in a basement, barely any food or water, not even knowing if they would survive.
It's heartbreaking to hear stories like that, and it really shows you the scale of this humanitarian crisis. Millions of people have had to leave their homes, families are being separated, lives are just completely upended, and it's not just happening in Ukraine, this is affecting the whole world.
You're right, the refugee crisis is a huge problem. Millions of Ukrainians have had to flee to neighboring countries, and it's putting a strain on resources and everything. And then there are the people who are still in Ukraine, who've had to leave their homes but can't get out of the country. They're just trying to find somewhere safe, somewhere they can get help.
Yeah, it's a massive problem, and it's only going to get worse as this war drags on.
And we can't forget about the mental and emotional toll this is taking on people. The trauma, the grief, the constant fear and not knowing what's going to happen next, that's going to leave a mark on the Ukrainian people for a long time.
Absolutely. This war is going to leave deep scars, and it's going to take years, maybe even decades, for Ukraine to truly heal.
Okay, so we've talked about the humanitarian crisis, the geopolitical situation, what's going on inside Russia. But
Yeah.
there's one more thing we need to talk about, and it's a big one. Nuclear weapons.
Right, the elephant in the room. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, the one everyone's been worried about since this whole thing started.
It's honestly scary to even think about it. Putin keeps making these threats, saying he might use nuclear weapons. He even put his nuclear forces on high alert at one point. It's not just talk. It's a way to try and scare the West, to keep them from helping Ukraine.
Right, we can't just ignore those threats. Putin's trying to raise the stakes, make everyone afraid of what he might do. He wants to make the West hesitant to support Ukraine, and he's willing to use the threat of nuclear war to do it.
But would he really use them? I mean, wouldn't that be disastrous for everyone, including Russia?
Well, we hope not. But the thing is, we can't really predict what Putin will do. He's unpredictable, he's ruthless, and he's shown that he's willing to take big risks. We have to take his threats seriously.
So how do we deal with this? How do we stop something truly terrible from happening?
It's a tough question. It requires a mix of things, making sure Putin knows we'll retaliate, trying to talk things out, and understanding what makes him tick.
So what does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, when it comes to deterrence, we need to make it absolutely clear to Putin that if he uses nuclear weapons, the West will respond immediately and it will be devastating. He needs to know, without a doubt, that using nuclear weapons would be a catastrophic mistake for Russia.
But we can't just threaten him, can we? We need to keep talking to try and find a way to de-escalate the situation.
Oh, absolutely. Diplomacy is essential, but it has to come from a position of strength. The West needs to be united, and we need to make it clear that we won't accept any more aggression from Russia.
And that means trying to see things from Putin's point of view, even if we don't agree with him. We have to find a way to address his concerns about security without sacrificing Ukraine's independence.
It's a tricky balance, no doubt, but it's the only way to keep this from turning into a nuclear nightmare.
So where does that leave us? What can we do as individuals in a situation like this?
It's a good question. I think the most important thing is to stay informed, stay engaged. Don't let the constant news cycle overwhelm you, but stay curious, keep learning, and try to see things from different perspectives.
You're right. We have to be careful about what information we trust, especially with all the misinformation and propaganda out there.
Mhm.
And we can also support organizations that are providing humanitarian aid in Ukraine.
Yeah, even small things can make a difference. And finally, don't give up hope. The human spirit is amazingly strong, and working for peace is always worth the effort.
Well said. I think that's a good place to wrap things up. This has been a tough conversation, but a really important one. The situation in Ukraine is complex, it's constantly changing, and there are no easy answers. But by staying informed, staying engaged, and holding on to hope, we can all play a part in building a more peaceful future. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.